Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about representation in gaming, which is a common theme not just at this conference, but something I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So I want to begin by grounding ourselves in why representation is so needed and so important, not just within the context of our industry, but also for us at GLAAD. And it's this idea of acceptance. Acceptance is the core of our mission at GLAAD. When we say acceptance, we don't just mean legal equality, although that certainly is a component of it. We also don't just mean moderation of online games and platform, although that is a big component and something we advocate for. What we mean is true lived acceptance in our daily lives, the ability for LGBTQ people to live their lives fully and freely without fear and without being burdened by homophobia and transphobia. Now, this is a very big undertaking because it means we're looking to change hearts and minds. We're looking to change the culture. And we know that media is a big driver of cultural change, and it's the reason that media is one of our biggest focuses. A lot of people think of GLAAD as a media advocacy organization, and that's certainly true, but that is something that is driven by our core mission, which is to accelerate acceptance for the LGBTQ community. So how do we drive cultural change through media? Well, the answer is authentic representation. Representation matters is not just a slogan, it's an understanding that the way people are portrayed in media is both a reflection of and a determining factor in our cultural values. And for LGBTQ people in particular, it's so important because this is what allows us to see ourselves and to recognize ourselves and to be able to live out our identities and live out our truths. Now, I'm going to be focusing today on transgender representation specifically, and I think this is even more important because there are a couple of reasons why it's timely and it's so needed at this moment. The first is simply that the transgender community is under attack from all sides. We're facing a torrent of online harassment and abuse. We're seeing transphobic ideologies take hold all over the world. We're seeing a continued epidemic of violence against trans people, and some of our past hard-won victories are being rolled back. The second reason why representation is so needed right now is because of lack of personal knowledge. If you poll Americans and ask if they know someone in their personal lives who is lesbian, gay, or bisexual, the overwhelming majority say that they do. And if you ask that same question for trans people, the overwhelming majority say that they don't know someone in their personal lives who is trans. And this means that for that large percentage of people, everything that they know about the transgender community is learned through media. And so we have to ask ourselves, how is media filling that void? How are games filling that void? Are games showing characters who are authentic and accurate, or are they perpetuating the same harmful, degrading stereotypes? And unfortunately, many games of the past have chosen to do the latter. Now, I can't go through every example of trans characters in games in the past, but I've summarized it here with a few common themes that you'll encounter. The first example here are related to the two most common trans characters in games, Birdo and Poison. Again, can't go into their entire backstories, but the problem with these characters is that there's an element of ambiguity that lends to a certain humor or salaciousness to the character, as if this character has some secret or something to hide, and that's supposed to be titillating to the audience. We also see trans characters here, as you can see, villains in 2 Resident Evil games that are evil, depraved. This is related to the long-standing queer-coded villains trope, which goes back nearly a century in cinema. There's also trans characters that conform to the sexual deceiver trope, something very, very common from, again, film and television. And it's this idea that trans women are trying to deceive and trick straight men into having sex. And this trope is not only very common, it's incredibly insidious because it is one of the leading reasons or pretext for why violence is committed against the transgender community. And lastly, this is kind of an umbrella trope, is this idea that trans people are portrayed as deviant or pathetic or sad or someone to be pitied or looked down upon. if not worse, right? And if you were to summarize all of these tropes, I think the general idea is that trans people are only included in games if they can be seen as either a joke or a threat, and it's not good. But what I will say is, I'm sure some of you are looking at this slide and thinking, hey, I recognize some of these games or these characters, and I love these games or characters. And I understand that, right? It's important to recognize that games of the past have participated in these tropes, these harmful tropes, but they might not be bad games in and of themselves. And I want to emphasize that, because I don't want anyone to think that all bad representation is associated with bad games, right? You can make a really good game and also have a really bad representation of a trans character, and that's something that we need to recognize going forward, so that we don't think we're safe just because we made a good game. There's also more tropes that are insidious in very subtle ways. I want to talk about one of those. And it's this idea that trans people, and this is a trope that really goes for the entire LGBTQ community, but in this case, trans people are associated with decadence and societal decline. Obviously, that's not what these games, what you see on the screen. This is BioShock Infinite DLC and then the upcoming game Cyberpunk 2077. I don't think this is what these games are trying to say, right? Of course, I don't think they're trying to portray trans people in a bad light, but you can perpetuate an existing stereotype about the trans community without even intending to. And so I want to be clear that if any of the examples that I've shown on this slide or the previous one have made you feel a little uncomfortable or maybe even defensive about a game, that's kind of my intention, because it's not enough to just say, oh, I'm someone who loves and supports everyone. I don't have any prejudice, so I'm okay. I'm one of the good ones. That's a good attitude to have, for sure, but that's not enough, right? Because we've all absorbed ideas from society that are negative and wrong, and we have to do the active work to unlearn those ideas. And so I really want to encourage you to, as you think through some of these tropes, to maybe question some of your own internalized assumptions. So these tropes that we've looked at so far have been not so good, but fortunately in recent years we do have some examples of prominent, well-represented trans characters in games. So I'll start in the top right with Cremisius Aclassi, because he was the first, and I think Crem will go down in history as the tipping point for trans representation in games. He was really the first character in a game that showed that, hey, yeah, you can put a trans character in your big budget AAA game that isn't a joke or a monster, and your game will still sell like hotcakes. So we love Crem. Crem is a great character. More recently, we've seen Lev in The Last of Us Part 2, another very well-rounded, beloved, endearing character. And we have Tyler from Tell Me Why, which is an upcoming game from Don't Nod and Xbox Game Studios. And what's important to recognize about these characters is that they're not included for some sort of punchline or some sort of to serve some purpose, right? They're just characters. They just exist in the world, and they have their own stories going on, right? Crem is Iron Bull's second in command. Lev is just a boy escaping a very oppressive cult. And Tyler is just exploring his family's old home to uncover mysteries with his twin sister. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on Tell Me Why for a moment, because this game does something additionally which hasn't been done in the past, and that's have a playable trans character. We think this is so important because it combines the power of representation in its own right with the unique power of games to let players walk in someone else's shoes. And for that 84% or so of people who don't know someone who is trans in their personal lives, Now they'll not just be able to meet a trans person in this game, but they'll actually be able to experience a piece of what it's like to be trans. And that's very powerful and very transformative. And GLAAD has actually been working with Xbox Game Studios and Don't Not Entertainment on this game since the beginning of its development, and we feel very honored and privileged to be able to do so because we understand that trans gamers have been let down by representation in the past so many times, and it's important to get this right. And we're being very deliberate and very thoughtful about the way that Tyler is portrayed, and we're very excited to let everyone get to see and experience this story and get to know Tyler personally. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to get to work on this game. So we've talked about a few of the tropes of the past and then some of the more authentic characters in recent and upcoming games. But now let's talk about moving forward and how those of us working within the gaming industry can do even more to accelerate acceptance for the transgender community. I want to leave you with this one idea, because one of the common attitudes that I often encounter is this idea of defeatism or almost resignation, where leaders in the gaming industry will act like they don't have control over how audiences or communities will react to representation in their games, for example. And of course that's true to a large extent, but that's not the end of or shouldn't be the end of the conversation, right? Like, there is more that we can do, and we've seen examples of this in the past, where when developers and when leaders in the industry lead by example, there is a cultural change. So I want to demonstrate this reality through an instance that occurred last year. So if you're not familiar with the GLAAD Media Awards, this is an annual celebration that GLAAD puts on every year to recognize and honor authentic and groundbreaking representation of the LGBTQ community in media. And last year was our 30th annual award show, and it was a particularly special one because we introduced an outstanding video game category for the very first time. We had a wonderful slate of nominees, and the winner of that inaugural award turned out to be the Elder Scrolls Online Summerset. Summerset was an expansion to the popular MMO Elder Scrolls Online back in summer of 2018, and it included this quest line called Manor of Masks, where the player meets a woman named Renaid, and she's looking for her estranged sister who ran away from home to join an acting troupe. And as the player completes the quests and gets to know Renaid's sibling, it turns out that she is a transgender woman who ran away from home in order to live her truth. And at the end of the quest line, there's this incredible moment where Renaid and her sister Alchemy meet for the first time, and Renaid sees her as her true self for the first time. And it's a moment of love and acceptance and reconciliation, and it's beautiful and heartwarming. And for me personally, I love this story, I love this quest line, but what's even more awe-inspiring to me is what happened when we announced Summerset as the winner of the GLAAD Media Award. It's something that's unfortunately far less common than it should be in the gaming world, but it was an overwhelming outpouring of positivity. No matter where you look, whether it was Twitter or Reddit or the official game forums, there was an overflowing of love and support and acceptance. People saying how much Alchemy meant to them personally, saying that they wear her mask in the game to represent the trans community, saying that the game has been a safe space for them, a haven for them. Just incredible response to winning this award. And I want to emphasize one thing, right? That this is not an accident, and also it's not just because of Alchemy, right? I have to give all the credit in the world to ZeniMax Online Studios, because this is something that they've been laying the groundwork for years, to be able to show through their game, not just with their moderation and their community guidelines, although again those are important, but through the game itself, that trans people are part of this community. They're our friends, they're our family, they're our loved ones, they are us. And that is so powerful, and it's reflected in the way that the community responded to this award. And I think this is just such a great example for the rest of us in the gaming industry to show just how much influence we can have on the way that the trans community is treated. So I want to conclude by talking a little bit about where things will go forward in the future and areas that I think are unexplored. Something that you might have noticed on my earlier slides is that most of the positive, authentic examples of trans characters in games are trans men, whereas most of the harmful tropes were about trans women. I don't know why that is. I think it's just a coincidence, but it is something to keep in mind going forward that, yeah, we probably need some authentic examples of trans women, especially since we've borne the brunt of those harmful tropes of the past. Of course, we also need more non-binary people, more trans people of color who in real life are at much higher risk for discrimination and harassment and violence. So it's even more important that they're represented in an authentic way as well. Ensuring trans characters are voiced by trans actors. That's so important, and there are many, many trans actors out there who are so talented and able to help out with your game. When we're talking about telling trans stories, it's important to recognize that there's not a singular trans narrative. And also, the act of transitioning genders is not the only kind of trans story that you can tell. And I think we're already seeing this, right, with characters like Krem and characters like Lev and Tyler, right? These are not focused on the transition story because there's so much more to tell when it comes to trans characters than just that before and after narrative. It's also important to re-examine the role of trauma, because when a lot of games are very dark and gritty, and when you're showing traumatic events related to characters, it doesn't affect trans characters the same way it does other characters. And so it's important to be thoughtful about the way that is portrayed. Something I would also advocate for, as I've already alluded to, is more playable trans characters. Again, this is so profoundly transformative to be able to have that experience of walking in a trans person's shoes for the trans community and for the non-trans community alike, right? Also, keep in mind that it's not just single-player, narrative-driven games in which you can have trans representation. In fact, it's important because some of the most popular games that are out there today are not single-player, narrative-driven games. A really great example of this is one of our GLAAD Award nominees this year, Apex Legends, which featured the character Bloodhound, a non-binary character, which is incredible. I think that's so important that Respawn decided to represent a non-binary character in a game which easily could have sidestepped the issue of representation entirely. I think that's something that should be lauded. So these are just a few ideas of where trans representation can go in the future, and I hope it gives you something to think about. And I'll end on this note, which is that trans storytelling really requires trans voices behind the scenes. It's an unfortunate reality that many of the stories about trans people in games and film and television as well have been told by non-trans people. And trans people need the ability to tell our own stories. So you can work with trans developers and consultants, and GLAAD is one of those. We're here as a resource. If you need us, feel free to contact me personally if you'd like to talk more. But the important thing is authentic trans voices, telling our own stories, and together we can make a difference and accelerate acceptance for the transgender community. Thank you.